Hey, this is Mike Frolink. I'm the pastor at The Gathering, and I'd like to welcome you today as you listen to this week's message. I pray it encourages you, challenges you, and draws you closer to God and His purposes for your life.
Just one of the songs that you were singing earlier really touched my heart, and so much of what we were singing about is so relevant to what I'm going to share with you today. I did ask that there be that segment in there about that song, How Great Is Our God. But there were so many other songs I had no input at all into that really tie into what I want to share with you today. And in particular, in one of those songs called We Praise You, I have not sung that song before, but these words stood out to me. We sing your name in the dark and it changes everything. We sing with all we are and we claim your victory. And I just thought that was so relevant. You see, a few years ago, I was asked to head to the Philippines to be able to see whether or not we should start a work with Destiny Rescue in the Philippines. There'd been a typhoon, had come through, and we're very conscious that in a lot of countries when this happens, traffickers step in and try and take advantage of very chaotic situations where children have been orphaned, families are desperate, and they're looking for any solution to their problem, and people come in and offer work and offer to look after their children, to adopt them and all sorts of things. And we were concerned this major typhoon had come through and was going to create this very situation in the Philippines. And so I headed over there with a guy called Luke, who was one of our rescue managers at the time, to scout out the land, a little bit like Joshua and Caleb got to scout out the land. And not knowing where to start, we headed to, firstly, the ravaged areas from the typhoon, the poor areas, and saw the devastation that was there, very similar to what we see today in Australia with the floods. A lot of desperation, a lot of hope just being taken from people. But we ended up landing back in Manila, where there had been a thriving sex industry for many years. And we, again, not knowing where to look, we started asking questions, and I was able to talk to a taxi driver and said, take us to a place where we'd be able to find children who are being sold for sex. Obviously, they thought we were tourists looking for those sorts of things and were trying to fit into that scene. And they took us down this street, and it looked like a street that had been closed, like it was a close of business, that everything was shut. There were roller shutters that were down and locked up. And he said, over there, and there was a big white roller door that was down in front of a building. And I said, but it's closed. He said, no, knock on the door. So I went over and knocked on this roller door, and this little window opened up like you'd see in the movies. His eyes peered through and started asking me why I was there, and I told them. And then they closed the little window, click, click, opened it up again, the whole roller door, and we walked in. Inside it was empty, except for a door to another room. And we walked over, and again, he unlocked this door and opened the door, and there inside were 10 or 15 frightened young women who were available, if we wanted to purchase and take away for sex. We made some excuses and we got out of there, but it was very, very confronting to me to think, what is the future for these kids? And they weren't all children, there were young women there too, but what a frightening and horrible thought about what they have to live with. We then went to other places, to some bars and different places, again, trying to fit into this party scene that is created over there, trying to pretend like we're having a good time. But everywhere we go, there are young women being handled by old, lonely men, and young men out there having parties thinking this is how you have a good time. And the whole time our hearts are breaking, thinking, what is the life of these young women? How do people live like that? How was I not aware of how bad it can be? And we found ourselves at a place called Angeles City in Manila, and that's shown in the photos here. It's called Walking Street, this particular place, and there's bar after bar after bar in this place. And everywhere you go in, there could be up to 300 young women working in these places, and lots of tourists and lots of locals as well in there taking advantage of the flesh trade. We went from place to place, again, just trying to fathom what is the extent of this problem. How do we tackle this in the Philippines? And we got to the end of the night. It was perhaps 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and we sat down at a bar at the end of the street. It was an open bar. It was open to the street. And Luke and I were just talking about what is our next step? What do we do? And it happened to be we were about the only people in the bar. But it was a karaoke bar, and there were screens up similar to what you have here, and they were just playing music anyway, and words were coming up on the screen, and we were just flicking through the songbook, and what song was in there that stuck out to me? How Great Is Our God by Chris Tomlin. There in that place, there was somehow on that song list, that song. I said, come on, Luke, let's sing this. And we stood there and started to sing, and we stirred in our spirit. And I was just so reminded today in your worship service. It really touched me today to be singing that song again. And we stood in that bar with our hands raised, and we're singing, How Great Is Our God. Sing with me. How great is our God. And all will see how great. How great is our God. And we were actually in the act of worshiping God. We weren't no longer just singing a song. We felt God's presence there with us. And as the song finished, there was applause. We opened our eyes and turned around, and maybe 20 or 30 working girls who had finished their shift for the night were standing there. Tears running down their face, clapping and cheering. There was God in that brothel. There was God in that place. We've since started to work in the Philippines, and we've got agents working over there with the police. And since we've started that work, we've now seen more than 1,700 trafficking victims rescued out of the Philippines. And this photo there is showing girls being led away after one of the raids that we did. We provide the girls with a towel to put over their heads so that they can protect their dignity. Often the media are floating around wanting to take photographs. And so you usually see any of these photos of girls are covering themselves up as they're being led away to safety. So I'm here today to share with you how your church's involvement, how your investment in what we do has resulted in things like this, has seen God's faithfulness just over and over again. God has been just multiplying what you have given. And today I want to share a little bit about how God is not just a God of addition. You know, when you invest in the kingdom, it doesn't just accumulate, it multiplies. There are so many verses in the Bible that teach and talk about this. And I'll just touch on a couple here. In 2 Corinthians 9 verse 6, it says, remember this, whoever sows sparingly will also reap sparingly. And whoever sows generously will also reap generously. Galatians 6 verse 9 says, let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we'll reap a harvest if we do not give up. Mark 4 verse 8 says, still other seed fell on good soil. It came up and grew and produced a crop. It didn't just add to that. It was multiplying 30, 60 and some 100-fold. Jesus himself multiplied again and again. And we know the story of where he fed the 5,000. Mark chapter 6 is one of the accounts of that. It says, he taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks. And that's what I see us doing today, giving thanks to God. And then he broke the loaves and he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. And he also divided the 2 fish amongst them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of fish and bread. The number of men who had eaten was 5,000. If we were to look back over the last couple of years, say from 2020, I think somehow that year is going to stick in our minds for a while, right? It's been a tough couple of years for most of us. And we've all had an onslaught of challenges to face. So much difficulty. We've had travel, problems we haven't been able to travel, sometimes within our own state. There's been times when we haven't been able to travel more than a few kilometres from our own home here in Australia. We've all been affected by this. Some of our work has been terminated. Some of our work has been restricted. The mandates have affected us in all sorts of different ways. There's fear constantly being promoted from the TV. Every night on the news there's something, and when they finally stop talking about COVID, we're talking about wars and floods. There's always so much negativity that's out there. And with so much uncertainty, a global negativity that's out there, there's so little hope that's being offered along with that. We're constantly fed this diet of fear without hope. It was a year ago that I spoke here was March of last year, and I was sharing with you at that point in 2021 what God had done through Destiny Rescue in 2020, and I remember reporting to you that even though we had been experiencing the biggest upheaval in our society in my lifetime anyway, God still was faithful, and we saw 750 kids that year rescued in 2020. Well, I'm here to report to you that God is bigger than the problems that we face. God is greater. How great is our God? How good is He? Thank you for praying and being faithful, because that year, last year, we continued to do what God called us to do, acting in faith and acting with the resources you placed in our hands. And by the end of 2021, we saw that return more than 3 times what we did the previous year. We had 2,386 victims rescued in 2021. That is the biggest growth that Destiny Rescue has ever seen. That's the biggest year of rescues that we've ever done, and all that was done despite the obstacles that we could see in front of us and despite what seemed like impossible odds to us. But you know what? This year I reckon we're going to do even more. The rate that we were rescuing at the end of last year, if that trajectory continues, we're going to blow that out of the water. You're going to see God move again, and I hope to come back next year and share with you again what God has done with the seeds that you have sown in this ministry. Last time I spoke to you, I had to bite my tongue. There was a couple of new projects that were happening, and we don't like to report and talk too much about those until they get through their pilot phase. And we're sure they're going to work and we know exactly what needs to happen. But there were 2 projects that we either started or were going to start last year in Uganda. It's a country that's close to my heart. I've visited Uganda many times. And I'd like to report to you that by the end of last year, we rescued 443 kids from street prostitution in Uganda alone. And I just get excited when I see the reports come through. I love to read the reports that are coming through from Uganda. The names are spectacular. These kids have names like Precious, Blessing, Mercy, Charity, Sunday. And recently I saw Kevin come in there somehow. And it brings a smile on your face as you're looking at these words until you start reading their stories. And you realise how tough it's been for these kids. And I'd like to read to you now the notes as they came through from the counsellor. So here are the notes from our counsellor. She was very emotional during the interview. She narrated that her parents divorced because her father was very violent, and therefore she grew up with her stepmother, who did not show her any affection as a young girl growing up. She finished her primary leaving examination, but her results were withheld because of school fee debts. Therefore, she could not join secondary school. Staying home without studies, she connected with some old friends from her former school who had dropped out of school earlier and had joined the sex industry. These friends advised her to join the sex industry instead of suffering at her stepmother's house. She accepted and joined, but unfortunately, after a few months on the streets, she conceived and didn't know the man responsible for her pregnancy, but she continued with sex work until the pregnancy was visible. And then she started surviving on her friends until she gave birth. After birth, she returned to the streets, and it wasn't easy because she used to sedate her baby as she went out at night, and also hurry back home to check on her baby, sometimes with unfinished business. What I believe that means, she brought the guy back to the house so she could check on the baby and continued working from home. But luckily, when her baby turned 1.5 years old, her father came and removed the baby from her and told her to carry on messing up her life. This was actually relieving to her, and she continued to survive in the sex industry until we were able to rescue her from the streets. She's 17 today. Follow that back. She was 15-ish when she headed to the streets to survive. But today, her life has changed. Now she has hope, not just for today, but for the future. Today she knows who Jesus is, and it's up to her now where she takes that. But she knows who he is, and she can see evidence of him because his hands and his feet were there for her and were able to rescue her at her darkest hour. So why do we do what we do? We've pondered this and talked a little bit about this at our international directors and leadership meetings, and we've landed on this parable that Jesus told about the Good Samaritan. I think it so really shows us how our Christianity can be lived out in practical ways. We don't believe in works-based salvation. We're not doing this to be saved. We're doing this because we are saved. So we don't do this to gain salvation. This is an expression of our gratitude to God for what he has already done for us. And when we think about Jesus and how he spent his time, he spent it with outcasts, didn't he? He spent it in Luke chapter 7, it talks about a prostitute that came in with their alabaster flask and poured ointment or perfume over Jesus. And he was criticized for that. He always seemed to be with sinners and prostitutes, tax collectors, all the people he shouldn't have been hanging out with. In Mark 10, he was hanging out with beggars, or at least responding to beggars, and his compassion, he couldn't hold himself back. He had to go and be there with those who were downtrodden, those who were walked by. The story of the Good Samaritan is so many people just kept walking by. It's not that they didn't know about the problem. It was visible. It was there. We see it on TV every night. We know what the problem is. Your choice is whether you walk by. The common theme, of course, is that Jesus' compassion drove him to show his love in practical ways. And in one of the stories that I love so much, it's missing out of there, the slide, is the story of the sheep, the shepherd who had 100 sheep, and he left the 99 to go after the one. But as he was telling that story, just a few verses before, he brought a child into their midst and stood the child in front of them. As Jesus was talking, he didn't have these overhead slides, which are very convenient for us to be able to use to tell a story. What Jesus did, he said, "Hey kid, come here, stand here." And in the midst of telling his story, he's referring to this kid. He said, "If you cause the least of these to stumble, it's better you have a millstone around your neck and you're cast into the sea." Then he told the story of the shepherd. And he finishes off that story by saying in verse 14 of Matthew 18, "In the same way your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should perish." As those words came from Jesus' lips, I'm sure everyone's eyes were also looking at, what does he mean? There's a child here. That's what motivates us as Destiny Rescue. We head off into these places looking for children specifically. We're not exclusively helping children. There's many times when we, in the process of helping a child, we help their family, we help the others that are working around them, but our eyes are on the children, trying to help those kids. So now we have expanded the work that we do. This is not picking up the world map very well here, I'm sorry, but that's circling an area there of Asia. We have 6 countries now that we're operating in within Asia. And in Africa, we are now operating in 3 countries. And in that area in America, the Central American area, we call it, there's 3 countries there that we're operating in as well. And in every single country, rescue looks a bit different. I described a little bit about how things looked in the Philippines, but every country is different. And the way we deal with that, in some countries we do what we call border rescues. That's where we wait at the border and we're looking for situations where somebody has been tricked and carried across a border to be trafficked. There's countries where girls in their most desperate situations, in poor families, find themselves enticed by somebody offering love, saying, "I will marry you if you just come across the border. I can offer you a job. We can go to this city or this city and I can get you work." And these girls, thinking anything's better than having to live poor, head off across the border, only to find when they're captured on the other side, they're captured, taken off to brothels, broken in, if you can try and get your head around what must be involved there, and then abused and locked up and never allowed to return. We work in those situations, stopping that at the border. We work in what we call covert situations, which is where we go in undercover, pretending to be customers and trying to put on a smiling face and fit into the scene, and all the time your eyes are darting around looking for the youngest who are there, trying to befriend them, talk to them, see if you can understand better how they ended up there and what solutions we can come up with to help them leave that situation or help their family. We have what we call survival rescues in some countries. These are kids that are literally on the streets, have no other way to eat. They'll exchange sexual favours for food to even eat. In some countries, they are still dedicating children to the sex goddesses and in temples, and they then become the sexual property of the whole village. We step in and intervene in those situations where we can. Some kids are being raped on a regular basis. This is truly, in my mind, some of the worst form of sex slavery. These kids are bound by family. They can't leave. It's dad. They've got no options and no choices. It's a brother, it's an uncle, it's a neighbour. But it's ongoing all the time, and we intervene in those situations when we find out about them. Where possible, bring the perpetrators to justice. But that's not always possible. Sometimes the best we can do is remove them from harm's way and help them rebuild their lives. We do raid rescues, where we work directly with the police and to have establishments shut down, people arrested, and as you saw in that photo earlier, those kids are then taken off to safety. And there's also labour trafficking, and that's an area most of us don't think about, but I can think of a particular instance of two young children that were in Thailand, 9 years old and 11 years old. They actually were from Cambodia but had been tricked by their uncle to be taken across the border into Thailand and were working in the tourist area of Phuket. Some of you may have been to Phuket. These kids were selling sunglasses and flowers. But what you don't know is behind the scenes, if they didn't meet their daily quota, they were being burnt with cigarettes and beaten. They had scars to prove it. And these kids confided in a Cambodian lady who was travelling through there on holidays herself, that they were being mistreated. And this lady came to Cambodia, sought me out, and we were able to organise a rescue of those two kids and bring them back to Cambodia and have the 4 traffickers arrested. And hopefully the 11 more that were supposed to come across the border just a few days later, hopefully that was averted as well. But that's a bit of an idea of the types of things that we are doing. But our success is not just about getting a rescue happening. The real success for us is, are they still free? Because there's no point in us just rescuing someone if they find themselves back on the streets the next day or the next week. And so staying free is terminology you'll hear us use a lot internally with Destiny Rescue. It's part of my role on the international leadership to continually report on how are we doing keeping these kids free. And so our measure of success is, after 2 years, are they still free? And during that time, during that 2-year period, we're checking on things like, do they have a safe place to live? Have we been able to get them into some sort of trauma recovery program? What economic solutions have we had to come up with to help this girl or her family? Is she pregnant? What other diseases may she have? There's health checks and things that have to be done. They can all impact whether or not she's going to stay free. And of course, we also want to share the gospel with them at some point. This photo means a lot to me. If you can see up the top on the right-hand side, that's a ute. Judy and I used to drive that ute around when we had the role of country manager in Cambodia, and it's still there today. And they've lined it with plastic, filled it with water, and you can see them there baptising these girls that had been rescued. You can't see his face, but that bald-head guy in the middle, that's Joe Mann. He took over the role of country manager for Cambodia, and his wife Tammy was sharing with me that Joe used to be a pastor, and he'd been involved in youth ministry, he'd been a mentor in many situations as well. He said that was the highlight of his life, to be able to see these girls come to Jesus and have the privilege of being able to baptise them. Now, this photo means so much to me. I've seen a lot of kids baptised over the years. And that photo was taken, I think it was about May or June of last year. In July, Joe and his wife contracted COVID in Cambodia. And Tammy left Cambodia on her own. Joe passed away in July of last year with complications from COVID, together with some other medical problems that he had. I recruited Joe. I sat with him over Zoom and talked with him about what it meant to be out on the mission field, what it means to give up everything to go and follow Christ, and he did that to his last breath. And Tammy tells me, no regrets. This is what he was called to do, and he died doing what he loved. Last week, there's a screenshot that I got sent to me on my phone. 35 kids in Uganda being baptised in a pool. It's exciting. It's great to hear the stories of the physical abuse ending and these girls getting on with their life, but what a joy it brings us as Christians to know that we've actually, through our actions of being that Good Samaritan, people can see what it means to be a Christian. And they choose, in a culture where from the time that they were born, they would never have even heard the name of Jesus. These are countries 98% Buddhist, or Uganda's a little bit different. There's a lot of Christianity that's there, but for many of these countries, these kids don't even get to know who Jesus is unless we are there. And one of the challenges I have, when I joined Destiny Rescue, we didn't have these big numbers to talk about all the time. But we do today, but behind every single number that I mention, there's actually the name. There's a real person behind every one of these numbers that I talk about. I quickly skipped into some of the lists that we have and some of the reports that we had coming back, and number 19 is Sarah. She gave her life to Christ, and her mother was given equipment and cutlery to help her find work at the local restaurant. Number 24 is Nisha. She now loves God and feels spiritually empowered. These are all reports after we've actually rescued and got them out of these horrible situations. Number 28 is Catherine. She's now training on hairdressing, and counselling has helped her spiritually to always forgive others. Number 33 is Annette. She's now born again and living in residential care, and she's training to be a tailor. In another country, I've got hundreds and hundreds, thousands of these reports that come through. I flicked to another country, and this one jumped out at me. In another country, number 481 is Vita. She is only 9 years old and living with her parents. Her father is handicapped. Her mother is the only person working to support the family. This is a story I got before rescue. This is the type of information that we receive so that we know, is this a situation that we should be acting on and getting out there to help with. Vita had to do daily labour work, she's 9, as well as sex work, to earn and help provide for her family. Vita has been rescued from this horrible life now, and we've been working with her family to turn things around. And it's just another practical example of how God loves even those. And these are people you didn't know the names of just a few minutes ago. And as I said, I've got thousands of examples I could share. I haven't looked for the most dramatic story. I literally jumped into these lists and picked a few out and just wrote those things down so I could share them with you today. But I've got thousands of those. We have a real problem in the world. There's some real problems out there. But we also have a real opportunity to show God's love, to show God's grace, to show God's compassion. And some of the other songs you sang today, I can't even remember the names of the songs, but they talked about us being the light, the lamp. We are that lamp. We are the salt. What good's the salt if it loses its flavour? We are the only hope that these kids get to see, but that hope transitions then into giving them an eternal hope. So we start by offering them physical hope for their situation. So what should be our response to misery? It's all around us, right? Everywhere we look. Jesus told a story in Matthew 25. In verse 36, he said, I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. If everyone up in prison, I expect you guys to visit me, okay? Haven't done it yet. There's been a few close calls, though. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? And when did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or even needing clothes to clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did it for me. So the lesson is that when we see the need, don't walk by. Do what you can do to help. Our God is great. And he's going to go into every battle that he asks you to fight, he's going to be going into that battle with you. So regardless of whatever those odds look like, if they're against you, remember you're on the winning side. 2021. We faced some pretty big challenges, just like we did in 2020. We had lockdowns. We had difficulty accessing venues for events. We had trouble getting into churches with things that just kept changing. The sand kept shifting underneath our feet. We had COVID deaths of staff. I had one of our rescue agents from the Dominican Republic, 40 years of age, with 2 children, married with 2 children, got sick with COVID, ended up being put in an induced coma in hospital in the Dominican Republic and didn't make it out. We've been touched by this too. But onward we march. We've been unable to travel internationally. I know for Judy and I, that's been a big difficulty for us, because it makes a difference when you're there and can see it. We're bombarded every day with the news showing misery, wars, fires, floods, COVID. We constantly got this counter clicking over with the deaths and the cases, and fear is everywhere. And we get a bit inoculated to it all. But I tell you, it's different when you're there and you can smell it. It's different when you're there and you can put your arm around someone. It's different when you're there and you're able to do something practical to actually help someone instead of just continually being told what's wrong and you're part of the solution. Because of the lack of travel, we haven't had many volunteers that have been able to get into the field to do what we need to see done. In spite of all that, we've had such incredible growth. It's wonderful to cheer and clap that we've now tripled the number of rescues last year, but boy, there's a lot of work that has to go behind the scenes to make that happen. A lot of jobs you've got to find for people. A lot of houses you've got to find, safe places. A lot of churches you've got to try and connect with to get these girls connected into a body of believers that will encourage them. There's a lot of work that goes on there. Then to do this, we've got to form new partnerships, often with people we haven't met. We're doing all this online through recommendations, and I spend, I don't know, Judy, how many hours? It's a lot of hours every week on video calls with people from all around the world, trying to just manage and juggle this stuff and try and keep things moving forward. But despite all of that, we've seen God's hand at work. There's been incredible victories that have been won along the way, and lives are being changed. I've just got to quickly glance at those reports, and I see how many of these kids and their families are coming to know the Lord. I get photos sent to me of baptisms and things that warm your heart and say it's worth it. Those late nights are worth it. Those times we've given a little more than we thought we could afford are worth it. And every time we do a rescue, we usually don't just affect the life of this girl, we affect the life of that family. The whole family dynamic has been changed now. When we change enough families, we change communities. Change enough communities, you can change the world. And your church is helping us to be part of that solution that God's given us to be a part of. So this year, we have some very similar challenges ahead of us. Throw into that war, the threat of World War III. What do we do with that? Do we stop? Do we hunker down on what may be, or do we do what we can today and trust God for the future? And I think that's the place we need to be at. It's very easy for us to get paralysis when we hear of bad things happening around the world and we think we can't do anything. What if this happens? What if that happens? Do good anyway. Be compassionate anyway. Give anyway. And let God show you what happens when He shows up. Now, I know there's a lot of you here, and it was touched on before during the message, but just before the offering was taken, that many of you are also facing trials and challenges of your own. And it's great and it's encouraging to us to hear stories of other people who've overcome and the wonderful testimonies that come through. And I don't want to trivialise any of your own journeys and what you might be going through right now either. Some of you are crying out yourself for God to show up in your situation. I just want to reassure you, He sees you. If God can show up in a brothel, how great is our God? He can show up in your life too. In the midst of any problems that you face, He's right there beside you.